Hi, welcome to this week's content where we're going to be looking at youth culture and deviance. And as usual, I'm going to break the videos up into a few parts. Going to begin by looking at very broadly at youth culture and deviance, then look at a more specific issue around the privatisation and criminalisation of public space. That's also going to include a bit of a case study on culture jamming. And then part 3, I'll be looking at a kind of case study about graffiti. So let's get going on youth culture and deviance. So just to kind of, as a bit of a reminder from maybe our first year in introductory courses where you may have looked at this already, youth sociologists are interested in youth cultures because they're a key site where young people form their identity. They're studied across and for a number of reasons, particularly around the way that, in the one hand, youth sociologists are interested in that youth transitions thing from, getting your own place to live, getting a job through education, developing that relationships and all that kind of thing. It's seen that kind of youth culture has been separate to that. That's where you kind of go and do your creativity and leisure and art and, consumption. More recently, we're kind of bringing those things together more and realising that they're not so much apart and that really to have expertise about the way young people transition from being a child to adult, we really need to consider this kind of youth culture aspect as well. So we can think of these through a bunch of tensions, I suppose, through hegemony and resistance, through tensions more generally in consumer and pop culture around what's mainstream and what's subcultural and resistive and what's a form of dissent maybe. We can think this in terms of the way practices around art and creativity may in some ways express aspects of authenticity and again resistance and stuff like that, but also notions of commercialization and commodification. They're particularly good for kind of thinking about issues that around tensions between creativity and conformity. Within most youth cultures, there's always kind of a bit of both going on there. There's creativity often going on to try and separate themselves from more adult mainstream cultures, but also then can be conformity within those subcultures as well. So this again speaks to identity and ideology in a similar way. As you've probably heard by now, subculture is a particularly important concept for thinking about this, and it's kind of developed from the Chicago school through the Birmingham school. Today it's still an important concept to use, but it's kind of seen as really only being useful for looking at particular pockets of very specific youth cultural practices. Notions of neo-tribes and others are kind of dealing with that, and particularly the rise of the internet and digital cultures and the way that kind of these affect and create communities is important as well. In terms of these broad youth cultures, when it comes to maybe ideas of creativity and resistance, they tend to be seen as being through symbols and through rituals. So youth cultures tend not to be about some kind of Marxist revolution. They're more about kind of creating a space of autonomy to live within systems and to kind of at least have some kind of aspect of authenticity and being yourself. So most youth cultures aren't really about overthrowing capitalism, but they're not necessarily about, reproducing it as well. There's kind of tensions going on between those things. From a more mainstream kind of media perspective, spectacular subcultures have been associated with like risk and deviance, and there's aspects of that in the research as well. But really, rather than those kind of more spectacular or risky elements, the research shows that youth cultures are things that young people gravitate towards to find, like-minded friends and collaborators, to feel safe, to create, and to have fun and to enjoy themselves. Subcultures in particular are places where people that feel like they don't fit in kind of normality or mainstream, or, they're not the sporting people, they're not the popular people, are more likely to then, look for these spaces to find like-minded and similarly experienced people. Particularly the case with people that experience bullying and violence and stuff like that at school. What's interesting about subcultures in particular is that they often die off pretty quickly. And by die off, I mean get co-opted. So a particular form of resistive, spectacular subculture will begin somewhere and might spread around. It might also all of a sudden have pockets around the world where people are doing this thing. But, if it's successful, in particular, if it's popular, becomes more popular, and particularly if there's kind of fashion aspects, what often happens is that's co-opted by multinational fashion corporations, and then the images are used in next year's fashion, and then it kind of kills off the resistive and subversive elements of what the subculture is. So this is, again, just kind of background for what we're going to be thinking about throughout the course, throughout this lecture today. So in terms of youth cultures and considering deviance and crime and that kind of thing, again, remember that something that's kind of seen as deviant doesn't necessarily have to be illegal. Breaking everyday norms, is kind of just one aspect of that. Talking too loudly in a particular setting, swearing in a particular setting. The classic example that we use is kind of if you got into a lift and looked back away from the doors at the people in there, that would certainly be seen as kind of a bit of a deviant act. But as we kind of spoke about already in the course, what we're interested from this kind of sociological perspective is power. Who gets to be the one that kind of labels something as deviant or label a person as deviant? And this often depends on the power of certain institutions, groups and individuals, the ability to define, the ability to make the rules. Rules here, not necessarily laws, but kind of can be just expectations and things like that. Again, what can be seen deviant from one group can be kind of rational, normal, even necessary to others. And this is particularly the case, when it comes to things like crime. People, that from the Chicago School in the 50s, the analysis of those kind of criminal groups showed that they were kind of socialized in very different ways, often in, raw poverty, had very different needs and desires, and therefore taking part in a kind of criminal subculture developed very different norms than those kind of developed in mainstream society, with very different rewards and particularly how the very idea of following laws would actually be detrimental to them kind of, moving up the ranks in those systems. So again, sociologists, particularly critical ones, critical sociologists and critical criminologists, tend not to be too fussed with the morals, the right and wrong of what's going on here, particularly because how morals are defined, how laws are defined, tend to reward and advantage some groups over others, and often don't really have a lot to do with what's right or wrong or good and bad or good or evil, or all that kind of thing. This is particularly the case because we increasingly see that those with authority to define or enforce things are often seems to be the ones transgressing but without any real consequence. And you can see this in the various controversies in the UK around Boris Johnson's government in the pandemic, when they were kind of out partying, when they've shut the whole country down and stopping people go to the funerals of their parents and stuff like that. You can see this in the example of something like swearing. Most people do actually swear in some context or another, and in terms of that Goffman-esque performative of the self, we kind of pick and choose or manage the ways that we do that. You probably swear more in front of your friends than you would in front of your parents or in front of your boss or whatever. Some workplaces is just kind of full of swearing. It's the way that you communicate with each other. An interesting example, I think, is that, recent things have shown, for instance, that, police in Queensland have been shown to, they're the ones that are meant to maybe be regulating swearing in public, but are shown to have, very offensive swearing and kind of abusive practices themselves behind closed doors. And there's a link on the word swearing there that shows that for instance, male cops referred to where the female cops in the office sat as the C-word corner. So again, swearing here, some people have the ability to kind of do it, wield it as a weapon, and not really face many consequences. So something that's deviant, again, is very contextual to time and place. Think about something like noise, really loud music. If you're at a gig, it's what everyone's there for. It's what everyone's enjoying. It's what everyone's there to kind of socialise with and through. But then, we have the rise of, noise complaints around pubs and live venues in cities, where particularly in gentrifying areas, and particularly where older people are moving in to, live around a cafe's set or whatever, but don't really like the noise of a city, they make complaints about the pub or the venue that's been there forever. And this becomes kind of debates about, what's legitimate in that area. Is the noise, legitimate, or is it deviant? And councils and governments are trying to kind of come up with various regulations and laws and expectations around that. A silly example I use around deviance is picking your nose and eating it. There's some studies that actually show that there's a possibility that if you do that, you'll have a better immune system. Now, I'm kind of joking with this. I'm not saying that people should be doing that, but, why will we have a deviant taboo, for instance, if something like that is maybe good for us? So, Norbert Elias in the late 1800s, early 1900s showed kind of various civilizing processes and why this kind of stuff becomes deviant. But, to time and place, we can think about this from a critical perspective, and maybe in the future that's something we'll all be doing. More seriously, you can see this around, if one set of science, talked about nose picking as kind of health and that kind of thing, and being maybe beneficial for us, you can see debates, well, not really debates, social changes in the US around something like abortion, where experts pretty much universally say that it's a needed, healthy thing. It's something that women need to be able to kind of have control over. You have a kind of very powerful minority being able to regulate against this stuff. Think about the idea of abortion. It's gone from, decades ago to being deviant to becoming more and more normal and accepted and needed. And now we have a kind of reactionary movement trying to make it deviant again. Something like killing is another example as well. So when I kind of in tutes ask a question about, is there something that's, always deviant? Students will often say, killing someone else, but, it's the job of a soldier to kill someone else. So on the battlefield, it's not a deviant act, it's an act of heroism or whatever. So again, we have this kind of very time and place, contextual nature of what's deviant and what's not. When it comes to bringing this understanding to youth culture, what we need to kind of understand here is that youth cultures tend to receive a lot of surveillance and a lot of attention. So that in and of itself means that they're likely to come under be defined as more deviant, be kind of placed under more pressure, that the people participating in them are more likely to come up with against powerful forces. So when it comes to this kind of notion of deviance and thinking about youth cultures, really a lot of the relations towards youth cultures are just relations of age. I mean, it's, if hypothetically, if older people, in the street were likely just to see a group of, young teenagers walking down the street together as being dangerous or antisocial. And this is especially the case for any marginalised groups who often experience this kind of surveillance much more violently. And this is, particularly the case with the higher rates of violence on Indigenous kids in Australia and African American kids in the US, and the higher rates of the way that those people are killed by the police. So in terms of these kind of, almost theoretical games to think about deviance, they have very real consequences for people on the street. So thinking about this in terms of youth cultures, it seems to be that new forms of creativity, nude artistic practices are quite often designated as deviant by those in charge of being able to kind of define those things at particular times and places. Those that dominate now don't really want too many things to change, probably want to maintain the status quo. So, and we can see this across a bunch of different fields and different areas of society. So something, silly example again in a way, but it's, it was very real at the time that Elvis, back in the 50s and 60s couldn't be filmed on TV from the waist down. Apparently his hip shaking on television was just too sexual. Feels kind of absurd now when you see the videos and stuff like that playing on Rage or, on music television. But again, a good example here of the way that different norms, different regulations change over time. In the art world, for instance, Manet was seen as a kind of a symbolic revolutionary, fundamentally changing what painting is, but now it's, very much mundane, kind of everyday mainstream art. Again, another rock and roll example, in the 70s and particularly throughout the 70s and early 80s, David Bowie was seen as kind of a really revolutionary artist in rock and roll because of the way that he challenged gender and sexuality stereotypes and kind of played with different characters and all that kind of stuff. Was seen as kind of being emancipatory and progressive in terms of what the possibilities of rock music could be. But then, there's also some, well-known examples of Bowie apparently having sex with underage girls. So, is he an artist or is he a statutory rapist? Again, if you're interested in this, to look at more deeply, please look at the work of Catherine Strong, a really good music sociologist in Australia. So, in terms of what different artists represent, in terms of how social change happens, in terms of what's creative and what's authenticity, consumer culture, youth culture are really areas where this stuff happens, where it's debated. Some people kind of defend whatever's the here and now, and younger people come along and kind of challenge those norms. Subcultures in particular are debated about their authenticity, both from without and within. And what I mean by that is, say, something like punk. People that are part of punk subcultures constantly debate about what punk is, who's a punk, what's punk practice, what's legitimate. People from outside also do that as well and kind of challenge the norms and, say that it's violent or whatever. So the debates around this kind of stuff and around the practices and about the moral panics in particular often seem to relate to age again. Older people tend to denigrate the young. You can see this now in recent examples about the Eshe in Australia. I've got like an opinion piece there that kind of takes the media to task, and there's also a link there to the what's a kind of very well-made parody video about Eshes. New subcultures come along all the time, and they're kind of, again, used by the media these days for clicks, back in the day to sell ads or to sell newspapers. They tend to never be very well understood. They tend to be misrepresented, sensationalized, or just blatantly lied about more often than not, and kind of used to create these moral panics that tend to then end up with more and more regulations in young people's lives. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to come back and talk more specifically about aspects of the privatisation and criminalisation of public space.